All right, everybody, it is 7:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for taking time to join us today. A special thank you to US Youth and High School Rugby and to the president of Rugby Texas, Maggie Roos, for organizing this webinar. We applaud their effort and their continued commitment to the health and safety of their athletes. My name is Ellis Mayer. I am the co-founder and chief medical officer of Go4. For those of you who are new to the platform, Go4 connects schools, teams, and sports organizations with per diem athletic trainers for events across the country. Today, I'm joined by my friend and esteemed colleague, Drew Duckett. He will be talking about environmental illness and injuries in sports. He will be discussing what you need to know to ensure proper recognition and management of these conditions. Drew Duckett is an athletic trainer and adjunct faculty member at Boston University. He serves as the Associate Director of Healthcare Emergency Operations and Associate Head Athletic Trainer, where over the past year, he has supported the university's efforts in the fight against COVID-19. Drew has been in leadership roles designing and managing campus COVID-19 testing sites, managing the Student Health Services Respiratory Illness Clinic, and assisting in the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Drew remains active in clinical practice, treating patients from all patient panels within the Boston University community. Drew has an area of clinical interest and expertise in primary and emergency care, serving as a clinical resource for staff members in the areas of illness and infectious disease. Additionally, Drew is an integral part of writing university policies and league protocols in sports participation and environmental conditions. Drew earned his master's degree in applied anatomy and physiology from Boston University, and he has a bachelor's degree in athletic training from the University of South Carolina. He is very active in professional service as he holds many roles within the National Athletic Trainers Association, the Board of Certification, and the Commission on the Accreditation of Athletic Training Education. Following Drew's presentation, there will be a Q&A section of our program. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will do my best to have Drew answer them at the very end. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Drew. Go ahead.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Ellis, and thanks Go4, and thank you to US Youth and High School Rugby and Maggie from Texas Rugby for us to be able to be here tonight and speak on something that is very a passion of mine. I was saying, environmental illness and injuries are things that I've been studying, and it's been a part of, I would say, my expertise as an athletic trainer since the beginning, or at least my desire to develop an expertise in this. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about mainly three different types of environmental illnesses, or three different areas of environmental conditions in which illness and injury commonly occur. How to be able to recognize those, and a best plan of action for when they arise. Everything that you're going to hear tonight is going to be something that is very simple. Preventing environmental illness and injury is quite simple. And it really boils down to two things: having a plan and implementing that plan in a timely manner. And I say that meaning that all environmental illness and injury is 100% preventable when it comes to sport. Having the appropriate plan in place, an emergency action plan, recognition plan, a halt sport plan, or a safe sport participation plan. All of these things added together will help build an environment in which being able to participate in sport is achievable, especially when we have conditions that may be unfavorable weather-wise. I say that these conditions, or these illnesses and injuries, are 100% preventable. We know that they occur, but the poor outcomes are really what's 100% preventable. If we have the plan and we have the resources on site to be able to treat, manage, recognize, and provide the whole host of care for our patients. So I'll talk a little bit about this, but our target today is to look at heat illness, to look at lightning, and to look at cold weather, and how each of those have an effect on participation and have effect on the health and safety of our students and our patients and our athletes and everyone who would, even our fans, our referees, everybody who may be there or in a place where they can be affected by the environment. As Ellis said in my long introduction, I have extensive experience working with environmental conditions and writing procedure and policy for the university and for league that we participate in at Boston University. But I also have served for at least 7 or 8 Boston marathons, and served as a specialist in the heat deck. And what that experience has taught me is that environmental illness and injury does not discriminate amongst or between people of all creeds, races, colors, everything. You know, these sorts of things we need to be able to pay attention to and recognize that any one of our patients could be, or one of our athletes could be affected. So we'll jump right in. We're going to talk about heat illness first. Heat illness is the spectrum of injury, or I guess you could say it's an umbrella term that really encompasses a variety of different injuries or illnesses within it. Things that we typically associate with heat are cramps, or syncope, or exhaustion, and then finally we may hear or think about heat stroke. The important thing to realize is that this is a spectrum. It's not a ladder. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes we think that, oh, people will show symptoms, people will have signs prior to having exertional heat stroke. They'll start cramping first, or they may just, not be able to go on. But that's not exactly how it works with heat stroke. And that's not exactly how it works with heat illness. While there is a spectrum from more benign to extremely severe, it's not necessarily driven in a way that you have to have one before you have the other. So that's important. That's important to know. So what is exertional heat stroke? Exertional heat stroke really has 2 criteria, and it boils down to this: core temperature of greater than 104 degrees and central nervous system dysfunction. It's a medical emergency. So what does this mean? What is a central nervous system dysfunction? It's somebody who isn't cogniting well, somebody who may or may not be conscious, somebody who can't formulate, not just can't formulate full sentences, but can't formulate sentences that make any sense. This may be somebody that has periods of lucidity. They're able to hold a conversation and then not hold a conversation. Or they're able to hold a conversation but not be making any sense or any relevance to what the conversation that you're having is. So understanding central nervous system dysfunction and understanding how to diagnose that is crucial to realizing that a patient is having a medical emergency of exertional heat stroke. The biggest thing that we need to realize here is that it says core temperature. And for the longest time in athletic training literature, there's been a debate about how we can figure out what core temperature is without actually assessing core temperature. And time and time again, research study after research study shows that the only accurate way to obtain the core temperature is through rectal thermometer. Using this method, we're able to obtain the exact core temperature and monitor it as the patient or as the athlete begins their treatment. Using a tympanic ear thermometer or a forehead thermometer or even an oral thermometer have shown that they could be up to 5 to 7 degrees different cooler than actual core temperature. So when we're talking about making a differential diagnosis of heat stroke, which is a medical emergency, understanding what a core temperature, what the patient's core temperature is vital. That being said, I say that because there are other reasons that could cause central nervous system dysfunction. Think about somebody participating in sport, might have a concussion. That could alter somebody's ability to have a conversation or cognate and make sense or their level of consciousness. Somebody who has diabetes, having a, I'm losing the word for it right now actually, but they're having low blood sugar would make you have an altered level of central nervous system function. So I think that it really is important to be able to assess core temperature and know that those two things together are what cause, what allow us to diagnose heat stroke. So when we're preparing our practice or when we're preparing our event coverage as athletic trainers, it's important for us to know that if heat stroke is favorable, then how are we going to be able to obtain a rectal temperature? What sort of things will we need to maintain modesty, but also to be able to treat patients most effectively? So how do we get there? How do we get to a patient that has heat stroke? Well, it's pretty simple if you can do math. Being from South Carolina, I can say that math is not a strong suit of mine. So this equation, while it is the equation for heat transfer and the buildup of heat within the body, I like to look at it more simply, and I like to go like this. It's really just a balancing act, right? So the amount of heat that we produce plus the amount of heat that we absorb minus the amount of heat that we're able to dissipate. That seems a little bit more simple than trying to figure out what all the S's and W's and Q's. I mean, when you start putting letters in math, that just, that's where you lost me. But all kidding aside, when we talk about gaining heat or losing heat during exercise, it all has to do with internal and external factors. We know that as we begin to exercise, as our heart rate increases, we begin to increase our temperature. We know this because we start to feel flush. We start to maybe even some redness occurs on the skin surface, and eventually we begin to sweat. The body's temperature is regulated very well by the hypothalamus. So your body needs to increase its temperature not only because you have working muscles and the byproduct of some of that is heat, but they also know that to be able to exercise appropriately and at the functions of the body that need to happen physiologically work better at a higher temperature during exercise. So it's important that our temperature or that our body temperature does rise a little bit so that those functions can carry out normally. However, as our body realizes that the temperature is rising too high, we start to produce sweat. And sweat cools the body by evaporation through the air. So we sweat, the skin is cooled as that water evaporates off of our skin, which we can already start to see that there's a bunch of different factors here that play into whether or not somebody is going to build up too much heat or whether they're going to be able to dissipate heat effectively. So one of the things that comes to mind, what I just said, is that as the water builds up on the skin, if it's able to evaporate, then fine, that person is going to feel that cooling sensation, as that's actually what cools the patient, not the water droplet on the skin. That's why it's important to pay attention to humidity. The more saturated the air is with water, the more difficult that it's going to be for that person or for the water to be evaporated. So thinking about South Texas or South Carolina versus somewhere in the middle of the desert, or even different places in Texas, could vary greatly in humidity, even if they're at the same temperature. So it's important to realize all these external and internal factors that that play into that. So how do we get to exertional heat stroke? Basically, our equation is heavy on the side of buildup, of heat buildup. So is this due to the fact that we're not able to produce sweat? Is this due to the fact that we're not able to effectively cool our body through sweat and evaporation? Is this because we're potentially physically untrained? Is this because we have a predisposition to it? There's a bunch of different factors that lead to the reason why we're unable to dissipate heat. Some of the most obvious are folks that are wearing clothing, or folks that are wearing pads, or folks that are wearing any barriers to be able to evaporate heat. So in climates where heat stroke may be favorable, and I don't mean climates as in the South, I mean climates as in conditions where heat stroke may be favorable, that is all about what folks are wearing. And so when we remove padding, or remove any barriers to evaporation, even a sweatshirt or things like that, that increases the ability for the body to cool itself when it needs to do so. So basically, heat stroke is a medical emergency that is a buildup of heat because the body is not able to effectively cool itself given the mechanisms that it already has. So is this really a big deal? Well, I'll say roughly about 600 people a year die due to heat stroke. About 5% of those are due to exertional related heat stroke or exercise induced heat stroke. So that's great news that the percentage is so low amongst the athletic population, but that's still unnecessary death that is occurring. And it's generally occurring in it's generally occurring in males, but it's generally occurring in our age groups from high school through early college years. And the reason for that all has to do with training and time of year and body composition and desire to achieve, and all of those affect males a little bit different than they affect females, or the type of exercise that has been designed to do that for these folks is different. So how do we participate safely? Well, as an athletic trainer, we follow national guidelines. We follow guidelines that have been instilled by the National Athletic Trainers Association, we and our regional athletic training boards and bodies. And so this graphic shows or gives a great understanding of where we could participate and what our risk is actually going to be. So obviously, ambient temperature and relative humidity play a great factor into knowing how safe it'll be to participate in the heat. And so this graph shows us where we expect our risk to be. So anything below the triangles, anything below basically 50% relative humidity, even up to 94, 97 degrees. We can participate safely with a very low risk. So somebody that is, participating in a place that is very dry but very hot doesn't have near the risk as somebody that is playing in a spot that is moderately warm but very humid. So I think that this just goes to show that humidity and the different types and places of where people are extremely important. Not just where you are and where you're training, but where you're going. In the next slide, we'll actually talk more about that. But I want to pause here just to take a look at this. And some of you who are familiar with wet bulb globe temperature, some of you who are familiar with relative humidity are probably looking at me like I have 6 eyes right now. Drew, do you realize talking to people all across the state of Texas, maybe once, does it ever get below a wet bulb globe temperature of 75 degrees or 85 degrees when you're saying that we should cancel these practices or these sports? And it's that is the guidance, and that is the guideline. I can tell you that we have people safely participate in sport when the wet bulb globe temperature is well over 90 degrees. That has to do with acclimatization, and that's what we'll talk about moving forward. This is perhaps one of my favorite slides in the presentation. And what it demonstrates is regional heat stress and zones throughout the United States of folks who train in a certain area, what their heat stress is and should be. The article goes on to explain folks that are in category 1 are not acclimatized to be able to handle and participate safely at the temperatures that folks in category 2 or category 3 are. So when we look at a state, even a state like Texas, you see that there's 2 different zones and 2 different regions for safe participation amongst regional heat safety data. So somebody that's in Lubbock versus somebody who's in San Antonio would have different heat stress guidelines that they should follow due to the normal acclimatization of each person within that region. So where does this come into play? Well, it comes into play when somebody who is trained for 6 weeks in Lubbock goes and plays a weekend tournament in San Antonio. The person from that area from the area of greater, less, let me restart that. So just to make it clear, someone who is moving from a training of category 2 to participate in a tournament that is in category 3 could anticipate a more difficult time dissipating heat at a threshold that is common for the category 3 area. Does that mean that they shouldn't participate in that tournament? That's not what I'm saying, but what I am saying is that it needs to be recognized and understood. Let me give you another example, something that's a little bit more, I won't say practical, but something that I think about in my daily practice. Men's lacrosse at Boston University. Take a look at the map and you see Boston, Massachusetts, way over on the right-hand side of Massachusetts in category 1. In the Patriot League, we participate against teams that are in central Pennsylvania, but also in Maryland and Washington, D.C. During the springtime, we play a lot of lacrosse. And we'll go to Maryland twice to play against Navy or Loyola, Maryland. And oftentimes, we will be playing in weather that is 30 degrees, that is 40 degrees, and we'll come down to Maryland and have one game and it'll be 70 or 75 degrees. So we have to really make sure that our team, that our players are safe from a risk standpoint. Do we continue to participate? Yes, we do. We do participate in these games, but it is the job of the athletic trainers to be able to assess that risk and understand that our folks have not been acclimatized, which takes a week to 2 weeks, training in a specific environment for mitochondrial changes, other physiological changes to occur for your body to be able to effectively have changes that will protect you and dissipate more heat at a higher threshold. So what do? How do I make sure that our team is safe to be able to just participate when there's a 40-degree swing in what we've been practicing playing in versus what we're going to go down there and play in one day? It's not practical for me to say, oh, well, we're going down there to play a game, so we need to pack up and spend a week in Maryland. Although this time of year, I would much rather spend a week in warm weather. But we take the necessary precautions and call ahead and say, listen, I know that it's not out of the ordinary for you guys, and that the humidity is not going to be that much, but we haven't participated in weather that's like this. So these are the things that I need available for me. I need to know what the ambient temperature is. I need to know what the relative humidity is. I need to know what the wind speed is supposed to be. I need to know all of that sort of stuff. Plus, I need to have access to a cold tub. I need to have access to ice. I need to have access to water. So all of those sorts of things prepare us and prepare our ability to participate safely. Does it eliminate the risk? No, it does not eliminate the risk. But what it does do is it sets a plan and a procedure and a process to take that risk and to take that risk safely. So across high school and youth sports, this map is used a lot, especially by local legislators when they're making recommendations, or even state law in many cases, on acclimatization and football and those sorts of sports. Very few other sports have laws about participation in the heat. Although due to the deaths in high school football players, many states, especially throughout the Southeast, have adopted these laws. But states that are in different regional categories or regional heat safety data realize that it's not a one size fits all. Something that works for North Texas might not work for South Texas. Something that works for San Francisco certainly doesn't work in Death Valley, and something that works in Boston, Massachusetts might not work out in Worcester when we're talking about the College of the Holy Cross. So it's very unique and it's very individualized amongst those places. So having somebody who is able to develop a policy and a procedure for the folks that are within your organization, in your club, at your location, is vital. And then somebody who's familiar and looking out for these sorts of things. For instance, if we had a team, going back to our example, a team from the north of Texas playing somebody in the southeast of Texas for a tournament, what should the healthcare provider know? Would it be prudent? Would it be the Go4 Ellis athletic trainer would certainly know, oh, this team's coming from this place. Maybe let's just make sure that we keep an eye on them, talk to their coaches, say, hey, let me know if you need anything. Just really being proactive to understand that some people from a different population may be at greater risk for developing heat stress and heat stroke than others. So again, it's all about planning. It's all about discussing this prior to the event. So just a minute ago, I said something about needing to know what the ambient temperature is, what the wet bulb globe temperature is, what the wind speed is. And so all of those may seem like, oh, well, this guy works at a Division I institution, so they have ample resources. While that is very true, I think that it's important to realize that if we just chalk everything up to, oh, they have ample resources, and we never look out to see how we can do this, then we'll miss a great opportunity to be able to protect ourselves. This and our athletes and patients. This that's on the screen now is a Kestrel, basically thermometer. It's a high-tech weather tracker, and they're available online. They're a couple $100. but they're developed through the Corey Stringer Institute out of the University of Connecticut that a lot of heat research throughout the United States is done. Doug Costa, one of the foremost heat researchers in the world, is a part of that institute, and really it gives us an opportunity to have one piece of technology that can capture every single thing we need. You've heard me talk a lot today, or so far, about the wet bulb globe temperature. And some people may have no idea what the wet bulb globe temperature is. And why don't we just use the feels like temperature, or why don't we just use the heat index? And the one advantage that while the heat index is a good indication of how hot it feels like and what stress may be, it lacks the ability to tell us what the radiant temperature is and how much we're absorbing from radiation. So that's what the wet bulb globe temperature does. Is it gives us that piece of information to put into our equation, because it's not just enough that the sun is heating the air, heating the atmosphere that is touching us, but we're also getting radiation energy from that. And we're also getting radiation energy, especially if we're participating on fields that may be turf, hopefully not, in certain spots where it would be well over 200 degrees during a summer day. Turf can be extremely hot, especially if it has the reflected beads. But back to heat index for just a second. The heat index doesn't take into account the sun. So when somebody says, or when we see on the news, or we see in the forecast that the heat index is supposed to be 105 today, well, 105 is what it's going to be like in the shade, not what it's going to be like in direct sunlight. And that's vital, because I don't know any rugby pitches, soccer fields, or anything like that that allow trees, or that allow shade, or that have big obstacles to be able to support a roof, unless we're playing indoors, when this wouldn't be really that much of a problem anyway. So I think that is a huge factor that we need to consider, and we can understand that radiation is going to be a big piece to us understanding if it's safe to participate, or at what level we need to participate. So this is obviously not paid by Kestrel, and not paid by the Corey Stringer Institute or anything like that, but I use these in my clinical practice, and it helps us be able to map what the actual temperature is, what the wet bulb globe temperature is, what the wind speed is, all of that information, and it tells us the wet bulb globe temperature, which is what we use to make our decisions on heat stress. That, along with the acclimatization of our patients. So having a policy, or having a protocol of acclimatization, understanding how many days it must take to reach and achieve acclimatization, is important. And understanding when it's safe to participate. For instance, let's say this week is the start of practice, or the next week is the start of practice. A workout that we participate in this week may be perfectly fine, and may be the max of what we're able to do, or a threshold for 15 days from now may be a little bit higher than what we would be able to do today. And the reason for that is, as our bodies are able to produce these physiological changes over 1 to 2 weeks, really more like 2 weeks, we're able to handle more stress, and we're able to handle that safely. So doing a build or a progression of what would be safe. So for instance, maybe only participating in certain parts of the day that are under a 85 threshold of wet bulb globe temperature for the first couple of weeks. And as we progress, maybe just coming out of that just a little bit, coming out of that just a little bit more, as we build up after that 2-week stress, or excuse me, after that 2-week acclimatization period, will allow the body to stress itself, but also give us a safe field to be able to participate in. I know it's not practical for us to think that if we must stick to these rigid guidelines, then we would never be able to participate. And we participate safely all the time. Why is it just now? Well, I think that using this stepwise acclimatization method will certainly help build heat tolerance and be able to help folks participate safely. So what are we going to do once we diagnose heat stroke? I've been a little bit all over the place in terms of talking about the environment versus talking about the athlete and the patient, but all of these things are wrapped together now. And how do we cool a patient? Well, there's really three methods that work to cool somebody, and we need to do that before we transport them to the hospital. When we're dealing with heat stroke, from the time that somebody's core temperature rises above 104 degrees, we have a 30-minute window. It's called the golden half hour. In heat research, they talk about being able to lower somebody's core temperature within a half hour from 104 or 105 down to 102.5 degrees. There's a 100% survivability rate. We will save somebody's life if we're able to decrease that patient's core temperature within that 30 minutes. Over that 30-minute threshold is a gamble. Organs start to shut down, patients start to lose function, and it can have long-term effects and sequela down the road of things that happen. Temperature regulation will be very difficult moving forward for that patient. We could imagine kidney and liver function as well once somebody goes over that 30 minutes. So what's the best method to be able to do that? Again, this is why taking the rectal temperature and obtaining core temperature is vital. We have to know, and we have to be able to get them into a cold whirlpool. It's an actual picture from the Boston Marathon a few years ago. And you can see the team that it is taking to care for this one patient who is in water that's about 35 degrees, and they're completely unconscious. You'll see that this person, yes, they ran 26.2 miles, and we don't necessarily do that during a rugby match. But what we do understand is that it's not just a football problem. It's not just a lacrosse problem. It's not just a problem of folks who are wearing pads. It's not just an illness or an injury of folks that are out of shape or dehydrated. Yes, body habitus and fitness level and hydration all play a factor in the body's ability to dissipate or retain heat, but it's a problem and an issue that we all need to be aware of and can affect pretty much every single type of athlete. I'll show you this picture for a number of reasons. One is that. The second is the care team that it takes to provide to be able to treat a patient effectively. So you see there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4 people standing, or 5 people standing around this patient providing care to them. They're not all athletic trainers. They're not all physicians. They're not all licensed healthcare providers, but they all are trained and have reviewed what to do in a heat illness emergency or a heat stroke emergency. So that's the take home here as well, is that there only needs to be one provider or one person who is treating the patient from that is healthcare licensed, and that's the athletic trainer. Athletic trainers curriculum for all certified athletic trainers is dealing with heat stroke and heat illness. So they're very well versed. Athletic trainers are very well versed in this. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist, and it doesn't take an athletic trainer to figure out how to swirl water or to dunk or keep the patient in the tub. But what it does do is it takes more than one person to be able to do this. So recognizing that it's going to take a team, understanding which team or who is on that team, the players of that team are going to be once this is recognized, and how you're going to be able to get the tub filled with water, how you're going to be able to get ice, how you're going to be able to do this all on site. The recommendation from it's a joint recommendation basically the pre-hospital management of patients that have heat stroke, is to cool first and transport second. And what that means is we're going to treat patients on site. We're going to treat them immediately there in front of us. We're going to drop their core temperature to 102.5 degrees, and then they will be transported to the hospital. And that's national guidance from the National Athletic Trainers Association. I think this is an opportunity for folks to be able to reach out to the local EMS crews and local, some of them are volunteer firefighters, paramedics, whatever, and just understand what the state protocols are and let them know that this is going to be treated, and this is the way that it will be managed, and should be managed on site. But dropping someone's core temperature within that first 30 minutes is 100% survivable. We have, in the past 3 Boston marathons that I've been a part of, we've averaged around 20 or so heat strokes a year, and we haven't had one fatality. So that's great. So like I just said, the take-home message here is to do a cognitive assessment, is to obtain a reactive temperature, cool on site and activate EMS, and lower the core temperature rapidly. One of the partners of the youth and high school rugby, obviously, is USA Rugby, and they offer emergency action plan templates, and it would be a great opportunity for folks to use that and to really write a plan. How is this going to happen in this specific location? What are we going to do? How are we going to make sure that heat illness is understood, is addressed, treated, managed, and transferred appropriately? So that's that for heat illness. Next thing we're going to talk about is, very briefly, right, is the lottery. Actually, we're not going to talk about the lottery, but we are in just 2 seconds going to discuss that if we play Powerball or Mega Millions, as I did a few weeks ago, then we should believe that lightning will strike us. Yes, we have a better chance to win Powerball or win Mega Millions than we do being struck by lightning. But it's evidenced by the number of people that play the lottery, that or play those 2 games, that we like to take our chances, or we believe in something that even has astronomical odds. Each of these is a sad headline about a team or a sports participant that was struck by lightning while participating in sport. And we hear about this time and time again, with even one happening just last year in Russia. There was a soccer player that was struck. Thankfully, he is making a recovery. But the interesting piece about being struck by lightning while participating in sport is that over 90% of the folks who say that they were struck by lightning were in the process of seeking shelter. And so what that means to us is that at some point, somebody realized that their threat was too great, so they needed to seek shelter, but it was already too late. This, to me, is one of the things that is interesting, and one of the things that we often like to think is that, oh well, the storm is across the horizon, the storm's miles away. It won't strike over here, or I'm fine, or that thunder wasn't too loud, or that's just heat lightning. All of that I understand, and when I participate in sports, I really want to make sure that I'm able to just get this one last inning in, if we can, or I want to get to this time limit. But we have to remember the safety of all of our patients and our athletes. Lightning can strike in the clear blue sky, what they call it, out of the blue lightning. This is lightning that often strikes at 10 miles or greater from the center of the storm cell. So you're thinking that, oh, well, there's a storm, it's about 10 miles away. Somebody can still get struck by lightning from that storm. Oftentimes, folks that are struck from the periphery of the storm, I won't say that they have a worse outcome, but we do know that the lightning, the voltage in the lightning is stronger because it has to move a further distance. So that in itself would be seems counterintuitive. Oh, the storm isn't quite near to me, I won't move. But actually, the strongest lightning, for lack of a better term, could be when the storm, when you're just on the fringes of the storm. So having a plan in place, understanding what the plan is going to be, and then what the players are, or the stakeholders, I should say, are in making the lightning decision to evacuate the field. Understanding is that building that we think we're going to go to, are we all going to be able to fit there? Does every team or every person be able to get to a car? What does this really look like? And what mile radius, are we going to be able to do that? And is that going to be different, or should that be different based on location? And I will argue with you that yes, it will. Most national guidance will say that games will be halted or stopped. When you start looking at big time conferences like the Southeastern Conference and the ACC and the Big 12, all of these conferences, they'll stop games when lightning is 6 miles away. And that is the absolute bare minimum threshold, when the storm is at 6 miles. And that's the absolute bare minimum threshold of being able to participate. I would argue that, and I do argue, and when I write policy and set policy, there's no way that we're even allowing it to get close to 6 miles. Just due to the fact that if we're on a field and we're at a location, if it's 6 miles, we still have to get off. We still have to clear. We still have to make sure that everybody is safe. And a storm moving 20 miles an hour will be on top of you in a lot quicker than we're able to move off that field. And so when we go back to that statistic, that 90% of folks that are struck by lightning are seeking shelter when they get struck, it's just evident that we don't give ourselves enough time because we're trying to get this last quarter in, and we're just trying to get this little piece in. So having a plan, having a cutoff, using app-based technology, it has become something that is just absolutely monumental. It has changed the game versus using things like flash to bang, where we count. In a last resort, I think those things are still options, but using an app-based lightning technology for sport would be fantastic. Understanding the radar, what's the forecast going to be, and who is making the call and making the decision of stopping or halting the game. National lightning guidance from the National Weather Service, National Athletic Trainers Association, Youth and Safety Sport, all say that using mnemonics like this are important for people to remember. Oh, if I hear thunder, then lightning is close enough for me to strike me. Again, we've used the flash to bang. However, the guidance that is coming out now saying is that if you hear a bang, meaning if you hear a roar of thunder, then lightning is close enough to be a danger or to be a threat, so that you need to pause that activity for up to 30 minutes, and up to 30 minutes until you come back out to restart, not 30 minutes until, restart warm-ups or restart whatever, but 30 minutes until that storm has cleared the area, or until the storm is outside the radius to be a threat. Again, that's the advantage of using an app-based technology. If the storm is a quick moving storm, then it may be out of the area of danger in quicker than 30 minutes, and you could restart safely within that time frame. Again, and having an emergency action plan about lightning and understanding where we're going to go, what we're going to do, who's making that call, and how everybody on the field is going to be evacuated safely, from fans to athletes to coaches and teams, players, and everyone for each venue that we participate in is important. Athletic trainers are trained to be able to do this, but having some guidance and understanding where they're going to be and what they're going to do and what their role is on the day of the competition is vitally important for them to be able to keep everyone safe. And the last thing we're going to touch on is cold injury or injury or dangers or participation during cold. And as we talked about with heat, there's a spectrum to this. And there, just like we said that we could gain heat, we can certainly lose heat. The major factors here that we have to deal with are participating maybe when our pitch looks like this. It could be frozen and we're trying to figure out whether or not it's safe to participate. So we have cold injuries that are on this spectrum again that are freezing induced and non-freezing induced. So freezing induced, we're looking at frostbite, where actual water crystals form within our cells, ice crystals form within our cells, causing the cells to burst and then die, which causes tissue death, obviously extremely painful and potentially limb threatening. Or things before that, where you might call it pernio or chilblains, where that's where your hands get really red and they start to maybe swell a little bit. All precursors to frostnip or frostbite. And then we have a core temperature decrease. So we start to think about hypothermia. It's interesting to think, well, Drew, you were just talking to me about being too hot. How do we get too cold? We're not going to be playing. We're not going to be playing all the time when it's snowing. It's like, yes, I understand that. However, wet and windy conditions at 50 degrees are enough to drop somebody's core temperature. Yes, we do create heat when we participate, but not everybody's participating. So folks standing on the sidelines may need to have extra layers. They may need to be under shelter. Understanding that could be a risk, and preparing for that is important when we discuss about sport. In certain conditions, especially the conditions that we have recently experienced with Arctic blasts, frostbite can happen as quickly as 30 minutes. So this chart is from NOAA, and it gives us a great outline of what we can expect temperature-wise. So we use this chart to understand what type of clothing needs to be worn and how we can best treat, I won't say best treat, but best be able to prepare our athletes and our students during this time. So for instance, if it's going to be 5 degrees, but the wind is going to be blowing at 5 miles an hour, we know that we're not taking any chances with that. We're going to pause the game. Or we may say we're going to have heaters for the folks that are on the sideline. Or we may say, you know what, everybody's going to be able to wear their parka and have their hot hands. Or we can wear full-length heat gear or something to be able to mitigate that risk. It's all about being able to mitigate the risk and not just say, hey, and figure out where risky is too risky. So I know we have just 2 more minutes, but I love this quote, and I think about it a lot, is that the more opportunity that we have to spend and think about potential hazards and the ways that we can stop them from happening and the ways that we're going to address them when they happen, make favorable outcomes that much more possible and that much more probable. So yes, it seems to be chance at times. However, I'm a lot more lucky when I have prepared and understand and have a plan and enact that plan and know that the plan that we've discussed is going to work. So chance will always favor the well-prepared. Going through these plans with athletic trainers, going through these plans with coaches, going through these plans with parents will certainly allow us to be able to identify and treat patients and treat students and athletes when these situations arise, but also prevent those situations from arising. So if there's nothing else you get from this, I think that we need to develop site-specific protocols and procedures for inclement weather. Have medical timeouts, which are small medical meetings just before any change of shift or after any change of shift, or the start of the day. Anytime there's a change in stakeholder, whether that be an event manager, whether that be an athletic trainer, whether, no matter who it is, hold a medical timeout so we understand what's going on and what these plans and protocols are. Have that with the referees, have that with the coaches, have that with whomever, but it just needs to happen to understand so that everybody knows what's going to happen, not just in an environmental illness or injury, but any sort of injury at all. They're all number one because not a formatting error at all. It's just that they're all that important. Have the necessary equipment on site. So as a part of your plan, identify what we're going to need to be able to treat these illnesses and injuries and have it available to be able to treat these patients and treat these athletes, because that's what's going to be most important. And then hire an athletic trainer. I think that the reason why I'm talking to you is that we realize that this is important. And an athletic trainer is an expert in the prevention, recognition, and management of these illnesses and injuries. So I don't know how much time we have, but I'm happy to take any questions that we may do.
Thank you, Drew. That was awesome. We do have a couple questions for you. So the first one is there an ambient temperature when athletes should not train? Is there like a good benchmark for that, or why do we use that, or why don't we use that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because it would be a lot easier, I think, for us to say, oh, well, the temperature is 95 degrees. Does that mean we can't train? Or the temperature is 75 degrees. Does that mean we definitely can train? And the answer to that is no. There's not an ambient air temperature that we can use as a cutoff. I mean, I do believe that temperatures over 100 degrees, regardless, going back to our chart, temperatures over 100 degrees. Let me see if I can get back to the heat illness chart real quick. Again, anything over 99 or 100 degrees, even if we have 0% humidity, we're going to be in elevated risk, or we're going to be in a mild risk zone. So if you want to cut off of where does my risk increase, it's about 100 degrees regardless. But I don't want to make the mistake on the flip side of saying, well, it's only 65 degrees, so it's safe for us to participate. Oftentimes, we see most heat illness and heat strokes occur early in training, so the first 2 weeks after a layoff, and at temperatures that are perceived to be not that hot. So somewhere between 65 to 85 degrees, depending on where you are, and relative humidities that are high. So it's a bit of a conundrum to think that, oh, well, if it's too hot, we can't go. But I don't want you to think that just because it's cool, that means that it's safe. Cool relatively doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe.
Yeah, it's funny. We talk about at the marathon on this, we always keep a close eye on the weather, and some of the days where we're most concerned are those absolutely beautiful days where it's that first warm day in Boston and everybody's feeling really good. They've got a tailwind and they're running really hard and training weather that they just have not been used to.
Absolutely. You raise a good point, Ellis. You're talking about training that you're not used to. For most of our heat strokes, again, it's acclimatization, but it's also fitness to practice or fitness to sport. Folks that are new to either this training period So they may be an athlete, maybe a great athlete, to be able to run 26.2 miles. They're fantastic, but they may be different to this sort of this environment, this training. They may have done it all flats. They may have never trained or they've trained only in cold weather, colder than Boston. And we're looking at these sorts of heat strokes happening around 60 degrees. If anything above that, if we're at 70 or 80 degrees on a one marathon day, the Boston Marathon is always in April. So it's still quite cool in Boston then, but anything above that, 70 to 80 degrees, or excuse me, 70 degrees is a very, very busy day for us in the heat deck. So those factors are very important.
I have another question for you. So can you talk a little bit too about time it takes for people to get their body temperature that high where they actually get into trouble? Because we think about these heat illnesses happening at the end of a marathon, which is hours, or in the middle of a long preseason practice, and maybe it's their second one of the day and the third and the sixth one of the week. So is there any science, or like how quickly can you get your body temperature up that high?
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point. We all think that, oh, well, it's going to take that. It's going to be at the end of a 3-hour practice. And you're right. Sometimes it is a sort of like a slow and marinated process where it's a long cook, right? But we also know that if the oven's cranked up high, we can get to that temperature very quickly. A friend of ours, actually, Brendan McDermott, who's a heat researcher at the University of Arkansas, has done a lot of research in this. And actually, in less than 11 minutes, somebody can get their, depending on the type of activity that we're doing. So think about repeated sprints. And when we talk about repeated sprints, I'm talking about 300s where you're running the length of a rugby pitch or length of a football field 3 times with a minimal rest break, and you're going back and forth and doing those repeated sprints. Or gassers where you're running the side of the field. In less than 11 minutes, you can get your core temperature up and over that threshold for
Awesome.
heat stroke. So it can happen quickly.
So another question we have is, how do you factor in the temperature on different playing surfaces into the wet bulb? So like, is there a difference between turf, and is there a difference between grass?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a difference between whether the turf has black beads or whether it has white beads, or whether there's sand or whether there's not. I mean, with the grass, depending on where it is. And that's the beauty of having the Kestrel instrument or instrument like that takes that measurement for you. It would be practically impossible to be able to do that without one of those instruments. The important thing, though, is that you take the temperature where those folks are going to be. So for instance, if we're looking at a scrum, or we're looking at folks, like, think about the offensive line. Now, I understand in rugby, in my limited experience, you don't spend as much time in a scrum as you would an offensive and defensive line playing football. But taking the temperature or using the device at that level is going to give you much more data than just taking it at what might be head height, or holding it, or putting it on a pole, or putting it on a stand. It's important to really get what is the difference. Sometimes you could be as much as 5 or 6 degrees wet bulb difference because of that radiation. If you are head height, or if you place it on a pole or something like that. So really being, between that 2 and 3 feet off the ground is going to give you a lot of data where the action is going to happen. Understanding that in football, at least, those are the folks who generally have, meaning the offensive and defensive linemen, are the folks that generally have the body habitus that predispose them to heat illness.
Great. So we have another question about lightning. So should we always rely on technology, or is there some other like good common sense rules or notes that we can kind of rely on or ingrain in our brain?
The great thing about common sense is it's never common, right? But if it were, there would be a lot more people that think exactly like me, and there's a lot of people that tell me that's not a good thing. So what I mean is, absolutely, yeah. If you feel, if any time that you feel that it's unsafe, then just because it says 30 minutes or just because the storm has moved out, that totally fine to use common sense. I think where we get into trouble is that, oh, well, I haven't heard anything at 28 minutes, or I haven't heard anything at 25 minutes, and I'm looking. It doesn't look like it's cloudy. It doesn't look like the storm's coming. If we don't know exactly how far that storm is, then we could still, again, just because it's past us doesn't mean lightning can't strike on the backside. But yes, if we think that we need to wait longer for whatever reason, then absolutely.
Great. Okay. And our last question is, I know we didn't touch on altitude because we're a little bit limited of time, but from a 30,000 foot view, this pun was intended, I am told. Is there a big concern with altitude as it is in regards to heat or cold or lightning?
Well, yeah, I mean, altitude poses a lot different or a lot greater physiological stress on the body. It can exacerbate the body's ability to function, I'll say normally, but just like when I'm talking about heat acclimatization, you're going to have to go through that acclimatization for your body to be able to work efficiently at a higher altitude. So anytime that we have to produce more work to do the same amount of or to move the same amount of load, we're going to produce more heat. So if you're undertrained, you're not used to the environment or the altitude, and you have these heat stressors, yes, it can magnify those potential effects. So for sure.
Great. So I think that's all the questions for today. So that's we've now at the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you again, Drew, for sharing your knowledge, and for Maggie and US Youth and High School Rugby for putting this together. If you need help finding athletic trainers for any of your events, or if you'd like to set up a demo for our platform, please feel free to visit go4ellis.com. Have a great night, everybody, and stay safe. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.